On reprend avec une intervention à deux auteurs. Je me réjouis grandement de les avoir ici aujourd'hui, tous les deux. Je les évolue tous les deux de manière passionnée et déterminée. Alors, on aura le plaisir d'écouter Lia Morra en première. Elle est professeure associée à l'École Polytechnique de Turin et travaille au département de contrôle et d'ingénierie informatique. Ses recherches portent principalement sur la vision par ordinateur, la reconnaissance des formes et l'interprétation des images médicales. Elle a déjà travaillé avec les second auteurs, qui interviendra après elle, qui ils ont pu collaborer au projet Fresco. Peut-être qu'ils nous diront deux mots à propos de ce projet qui a vu le jour aussi grâce à Facet, l'ERC Consolidator obtenu par Massimo Leone et qui a débuté en 2019. Antonio Santangelo est professeur associé à l'Université de Turin où il enseigne la sémiotique et la sémiotique de la télévision. Il a été directeur exécutif du NEXA Center for Internet and Society à l'École Polytechnique de Turin. Il est l'auteur de plusieurs livres tels que par exemple The Handbook of TV Quality Assessment 2013, socio-semiotica dell'audiovisivo 2013, le radici della televisione intermediale, les racines de la télévision intermédiaire, ça peut être un peu plus difficile pour les francophones, 2012, ainsi que Critica di ChatGPT, fraîchement paru en janvier 2025, écrit avec Sissa e Borghi, et toujours en collaboration, paru lui aussi très récemment, 2024, Immaginari del domani, tra Future Studies, Semiotica et World Building. Je leur laisse la parole. Je les remercie encore d'avoir accepté notre invitation. Voilà, la parole est à vous. Je peux chez les administrateurs demander. Rossana, si tu as 5 secondes de temps, tu pourrais demander aux administrateurs s'ils nous laissent la salle jusqu'à 17h15. Pardon, mais j'ai oublié d'y aller. 17h15. Enfin, merci beaucoup. Bon, Lia, à toi la parole. Je ne te la...
Bonjour à tout le monde. Je m'excuse, mais mon français est très, très basique, donc je vais parler en anglais. J'espère que vous me comprenez quand même. My name is Lia Morra. I've been working on generative AI for a couple of years. And especially we have been working on trying to understand how to embed concepts from semiotics within the analysis and generation of images. The research that I'm going to present today is funded by the iFood Consortium, and in particular is funded by an open call which aimed at producing there's a little bit of lag. Aimed at producing, at generating new AI-based tools for social media analysis. Social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, now X, LinkedIn, have been around for many years. They have changed the way we communicate online, our communication patterns. However, are very difficult to study because the data that they hold is restricted by the terms of use and also by the privacy regulations of, especially in the European Union. So acquiring data from users by using a donation process, which is compliant with the GDPR, is extremely expensive and prone to a lot of selection bias. So the idea behind the call and the principle with which we applied is whether we can generate synthetic data that can replicate the data that is being collected by social media platforms, so that it can be studied without having extensive funding for data acquisition. Synthetic data has been around in computer science for many years. There is an increasing trend in using synthetic data to train and test machine learning models. So here the concept was, can we extend this idea and use generate synthetic data that is sufficiently information rich to be able to be used also for other type of research, which is not machine learning. When we talk about image anonymization, we talk about the process of hiding or altering identifiable features within an image in order to protect the privacy of individuals. Our face is a biological marker. So whenever we show our face, we're showing private data. And in order for an image to be anonymized in many situations, we must hide the person connotations. In early techniques, we resorted to blurring, pixelation, or other techniques that try to conceal the information, the private information. But in doing so, they also conceal non-private information, which can be useful for, which make the data less useful for any type of research or training activity, machine learning activity that we want to do. So in recent years, in the last 3 or 5 years, there have been a number of techniques that have been proposed, which instead of obfuscating or masking the private information, rely on generative AI to change the image in such a way that the person is not recognizable anymore, but the image is still a valid image and in a sense can be used for something. What it can be used for, I think it's our question, our research question for today. What you see here are 2 examples that we will study today. One is deep privacy, which has been around for 2 or 3 years. And one is an example of camouflage, which is the technique that I have been developing with my team, which is based on a variant of stable diffusion. So essentially the type of generative AI that we have been talking for quite some time now. An anonymized image can be seen as a special case of asynthetic data generation. So if we, instead of obfuscating, we generate a new image. Essentially, what we're doing is placing the topic of anonymization within the context of synthetic data generation. And for synthetic data to be meaningful, we argue that it must be similar to, but also different from the original data. It cannot be the same as the original data, because otherwise we would be using the original data, what would be the purpose of anonymizing it. But it must retain some non-sensitive information in order to be meaningful. In the computer science literature, especially in the literature that deals with the privacy-preserving machine learning, we distinguish between 2 concepts of usefulness, which are utility and fidelity. In many texts, we see the 2 terms conflated or used somewhat interchangeably, but in reality, they represent 2 different things. Utility in our as a computer scientist means that the information that is retained by the data is useful, can be used for a given task or a set of tasks. So it is essentially a measure that is performance-driven, and we will see what it means from a computer science perspective a little bit towards the end of the talk. Whereas fidelity in the more general sense is determined by how well the synthetic data matches the statistical distribution of the real data. It is intuitive, but can also be proven that when fidelity increases, the privacy guarantees decrease. So there is a trade-off between fidelity and privacy. And the interesting thing from my perspective is that by focusing instead of utility, we can sort of find a little bit of more wiggle room in this trade-off. But it also means that it is not going to be possible to generate private synthetic data that will be generally useful, because if we want the data to be useful for all possible use cases, we cannot have any privacy guarantees. So we need to find a trade-off to balance these two things. And from my perspective, and then I will go a little bit more into the technical details, but from my perspective, I think it is not very clear in the computer science literature what is the boundary between anonymization and synthetic data generation. So why a certain image can be considered as an anonymized image and not simply as a new synthetic image, which is completely unrelated from or not directly related to any other images. And I think this is a very a question that is pretty much semiotic in nature. So I came to Antonio and the team at University of Turin to try and help me find an answer for this question. Why do we need an anonymized versus a synthetic image? For me, it's very clear, because if we can maintain a link between the original image and the anonymized image, we can also maintain a link between the anonymized image and all the metadata and all the other information that we can associate to the individual. For example, in the data that we have collected during the Facets project, we have demographic information that is associated to the original images, and we want to preserve this association. We don't want to destroy it in the process. So we need to have a link which is direct between the anonymized image and the original one from which it comes from. That said, which kind of sets the stage for our research, without trying to go into a little bit too much detail, there are essentially two ways that we can use AI to generate such synthetic images. The first type of method is based on inpainting. For example, the privacy tool, which is one of the methods we have been studying, is based on inpainting. So the person or persons are detected from the image, they are removed, and they are substituted with a new person, which may retain some of the characteristics of the original picture or not, depending on the method. So in this case, there is still a direct link to the original image, because the background is not substituted. It is exactly the same pixel-wise as the original image, which maintains a clear link, but may introduce other problems, as we will see. On the other hand, we have completely AI-based methods that are based on generative adversarial networks or latent diffusion models that try to replicate the entire image from scratch. So we completely lose any direct pixel-based connection to the previous non-anonymous image. We recreate a new image by manipulating the latent space of the generative model in order to change the identity of the person that we are seeing, but maintaining certain attributes, such as, for example, the age, the gender or appearance of gender, the color of the skin, the facial expression, and so forth. The difficulty of anonymizing images is that the private and non-private information is embedded in the same pixels. You cannot say this set of pixels represents the private information, this set of pixels represent the non-private information. The separation must be done in the latent space. So we must find a way to disentangle these two factors in the latent space and move the image in the latent space in order to fool the re-identification process, so make the person unrecognizable, but also retain certain iconic qualities that the original image had. Notice that by making the image unrecognizable, we mean fooling a facial recognizer. So in most of our research, both during training, but also during evaluation, we assume a neural network as a proxy of human perception. So by not recognizing a person, we mean that we are able to fool a facial detection system. Which is convenient because a facial recognition system is easier to embed in our research process than asking a ton of humans whether they recognize or not a person. But it is also practical because facial recognition systems are here and people can use them. So in order to protect the privacy of individuals, it is not sufficient to make them unrecognizable from humans. You need to make them unrecognizable from machines, because this is the reality of the world that we live in. So to design the system that you see here is Falco, is a depiction of Falco, but this is not very, which is one of our sort of competitors, so to speak. In this, which is based on GANs, our system, camouflage, operates in a slightly different way, but the principle, the underlying principle, can be seen as similar. One of the differences between Falco and other anonymization techniques and camouflage is the privacy threat model. Anonymization is not a property of the data. Anonymization is a property of the process that we employ in order to obtain the private information. So we must make some assumptions on the attacker and the resources that the attacker can use in order to try and trace back the anonymized data to the original identity. In our case, we use as a privacy threat model something very simple, which is Google Lens. On our cell phones, on our search engines, we have the possibility to search an image. And if I put my profile picture, if I search for my profile picture, I can revert, even if I don't know that this image represents myself, Google will tell me that this image is Lia Morra from Polytechnique di Torino, because this is something that is technically available for everyone. If I decide to use inpainting and change my face, and this is something that we have tried to do with a null version of deep privacy, We may obtain even very, very strange and peculiar results. For example, in this case, a lot of my iconic qualities are changed. For example, the gender, and possibly also the ethnicity, obtaining a result that is very, for me, very unsettling, of course.
Yeah,
But
weird.
But if you search, if you will tell you that possibly this is Lia Morra. Why? Because the background is the same. So if you search for this image, you can get a partial match. And this partial match will be much closer than the face of the non-existing person that is depicted here. This is what prompted us to say that we need to regenerate the entire image. We cannot only focus on the facial features, we need to focus on the entire image holistically, considering not only the facial features, but also the context in which the image is taken. Which brings us to camouflage, which is, as I said, based on a diffusion model. I'm not sure whether I know that this crowd is very familiar with the concept of generative AI, but of course, if I'm being too technical, or if you want additional detail or not technical enough, please let me know. What we can see here is a general architecture of a system in which the diffusion model, which is the core, operates in the latent space. So what we do is take the original image. Using the encoder, which is part of stable diffusion, we obtain the corresponding representation in latent space, and we add some noise. And the noise pushes the generated image away from the original one. We try to add sufficient noise to generate an image which is very different, but at the same time still a valid image. If you push too far away, you will eventually get a lot of artifacts and not a meaningful image. At the same time, we provide some controller, a caption, a text-based control, but we also provide controls which are based on the spatial composition, such as, for example, here you can see a semantic segmentation, where we not only provide a textual description, but we also provide a grounding, a spatial grounding of the textual description in order to specify where the concepts have to appear in the generated image. And these controls, this caption, instead of being generated by a human, are generated by another computer vision algorithm or another vision language model, but based on the original image. So this is not a random caption, or a random spatial distribution, but is actually derived from the original image. And this provides a boundary in order for the image not to be changed too much with respect to the original image. This is still, of course, a generative process. So we obtain multiple anonymized images and we pick one. So, but in principle, you could obtain hundreds of slightly different anonymized images. We have different architectures that have been proposed based on this concept, which I will call base and light, just because the light version is a little bit faster at execution time. I will not go into the details for the interest of time, but of course I'm available for question later. The main difference is how we extract information from the original image. So which type of annotators we use. And these annotators will help us to maintain a high utility, whereas the noise will help us achieve a higher privacy. So having developed this system, we set to ask ourselves a set of questions. Are we fulfilling our promise? Are we obtaining what we expected to have? So the first question is, do we preserve privacy? For example, if I look at myself here, do I recognize myself in these images? And personally, my personal opinion is that I see myself spiritually, so to speak, but of course I do not recognize, I wouldn't say that this is an image of mine. But we actually asked the Google Lens what the results were on different data sets that contain images of celebrities, or in general images taken from the internet. So, for example, if we look at the first data set, which is Celeb A, 70% of the original images are still available online. If we use an in-painting strategy, we can recover between 8 and 20% of the images online, which means that you have a risk of between 10 and 20% of being re-recognized online, which is not very good. Of course, the notion of good anonymization is dependent on the application, but generally speaking, this is not a great result. Camouflage will give you a risk of being re-identified between 1 and 4%, which is definitely lower, still amenable to improvement, but closer to other techniques on other type of privacy threats. But the big question from our point of view is, does camouflage preserve data utility? For us, as computer scientists, the way we normally study this question is by training on synthetic data and testing on real data, assuming that if we get the same performance that we had on the original data, we have useful data, because we can still achieve our goal using more or less the same resources. For example, if we look at one specific machine learning task, which is the prediction of facial attributes, whether you have bangs, you have glasses, whether you're smiling, and so forth, we achieve an accuracy of 90% on the original data and 89% when using camouflage. So it means that basically we obtain a model that has the same performance, even though the data is not the same, and we observe that there are major differences between the generated data. So with this in mind, we went to our colleagues and tried to understand a little bit if we could find a more nuanced definition of utility and fidelity that is more aligned with human perception, with the way the human perceive and analyze images. And with this, I will leave the floor to my colleague, Antonio.
Okay, so I share my screen too. Okay. Okay. Here you can see that the title of my presentation is Déterministique significative sur la possibilité d'utiliser l'IA générative pour produire des images pour la recherche socio-semiotique. It is because Lia and their research group asked my research group, and the reason why the slides are different is because My research group made part of the European project Facets, which was different from camouflage, but we were collaborating to another project that we are going to talk about later. And Lia asked me and my colleagues to give her a semiotic advice using the Delphi method. So I involved the four persons that you can see here, Silvia Barbotto, Cristina Voto, Remo Gramigna, and Gabriele Marino, asking them what you see here. We asked them to answer some questionnaires separately, so without knowing what the others were answering. And we asked them to answer this question. Our purpose is to have you evaluate a series of images generated by AI-powered computer systems with the goal of anonymizing an original image while preserving its meaning. Therefore, we need your input to understand which of the presented images best achieve these two objectives and why. Because we asked ourselves, can we use the images produced by camouflage, for example, to do a socio-semiotic research? Before watching the images in the questionnaires, my colleagues complained. I was the one who directed the research, so I didn't have to answer the questionnaires. I prepared the questionnaires for my colleagues. And they complained because they said, what you can read here. Here I quote some parts of the document that we produced out of our research. Well, they complained because they believed that the questions that you saw before were very tricky theoretical problems, because they said some theoretical concerns arise regarding the possibility that an anonymized image, which essentially modifies an original one, can retain the meaning of the letter. Indeed, even the notion of the meaning of an image is problematic, as it depends on what is recognized as relevant among the elements that compose the image by those interpreting it. Since potentially every component of the image can be considered meaningful, and given that it is impossible to know in advance what kind of interpretation will be assigned to it, producing a different image risks triggering very different signification processes, which are difficult to control. Here you have an example of the images that were shown to my colleagues. No? The original one is the one on the left, and the ones that you see after the original one are the ones produced by camouflage and the Privacy 2 and Falco and all the other tools for anonymizing images. And you can see that the images that were produced were very, very different from the original one, because the original guy is young, and some of the tools understand that younghood is important, but for example, the sexual identity of the guy is also very important, no? Because we can guess he is a dancer, but we can also guess that his sexual identity is blurred, no, in a certain way. But as you can see here, all the artificial intelligence tools didn't understand that that was a feature of the image that was important to reproduce, to permit human beings not to give this kind of interpretation. There were some other semiotic concerns. For example, here you can read, furthermore, since the image of every face, and indeed any image in general simultaneously has a meaning that can be iconic, symbolic, and indexical, ensuring that through an anonymization procedure, it loses its indexical nature, could make it unusable in social research. For example, if here you delete the Eiffel Tower because you want to anonymize this image so that nobody can understand that this guy has been in Paris, well, the image loses its indexical power, but it doesn't make the same sense, because we can guess that the owner of the image posted it on Facebook because she wanted to say that she was in Paris, no? So conversely, there may be cases where anonymizing certain indexical signs on a face without completely removing them still leaves the face recognizable, thanks to the encyclopedic knowledge of its interpreters. For example, everybody knows that Gorbachev had this spot on his front head, and then if you leave a spot, even if the spot doesn't have the same shape, no, everybody can guess that maybe this guy is Gorbachev, even if the face changes and you cannot recognize Gorbachev from the features of the face. However, and so you may believe that the question that was posed to us doesn't make sense semiotically, but in our opinion, and in my opinion in particular, it makes sense, because if you consider the basics of Saussure, no, of the structural semiotics of Saussure, well, he says that these three ways of writing the letter T have the same meaning because they are variations, no, of the letter T. Because if you share the code out of which you have to interpret what you see here in this image, you can guess which are the pertinent traits of the three letters that make them different from the L's, the S, etc. in the alphabet, and which are the pertinent traits that make them similar, no, inside of the alphabet, which is something that can be, of course, also used in analyzing images, because if you see these three images that are taken out of an advertising campaign, very famous, no, out of Armani, we can consider them as images produced by camouflage or tools like camouflage, because there are masculine bodies in the same position, with the same colors, with the same muscles, with the same enunciational strategy, we may say. They change their faces, of course. One is Beckham, the other one is Ronaldo, the other one is Nadal, but the meaning stays the same, no? Because if we all share the code out of which we have to interpret such images, we understand which are the pertinent traits that don't have to variate. No? If we tell a tool like camouflage to produce another image that makes the same sense out of the same interpretative code. No? So we may say that these images are like the three ways of drafting the letter T, as Saussure used to teach us. This is something that proved right also in our research, because here you can read that since the semiotic experts involved in the research on camouflage evidently share the set of interpretative codes dictated by their common belonging to the same visual culture, the Western one, and the same subculture, their discipline characterized by established theoretical knowledge, when presented with a given content, they almost always assigned it the same meanings. I remind you that they had to answer a questionnaire, but anonymously. And they didn't know which answers were given by the other ones. So I was the only one to see the answers, and I saw that they were very, very similar. To do so, they highlighted which aspects of the images they considered, which aspects of the images they consider relevant. Here is an example. Their most frequent interpretation of the image beside this text was young, glamorous, happy, Afro-descendant diva distracted by something, based on the following relevant traits. The skin, whose smoothness and radiance communicate youth, while the color suggests African descent. The makeup and hairstyle, hair of two colors styled in a certain way, which, along with the earrings, the background panel, and the softness of the lighting contrasts, convey a glamorous setting, the smiling lips, and the gaze directed off screen. So these are the pertinent traits of the image that mustn't change if Lia wanted my colleagues to produce the same interpretation when watching an anonymized image made by camouflage. We developed a questionnaire, as I told you before, and we presented my colleagues with many images produced by the anonymizing tools, based on the semiotics of the face, because my colleagues and I were experts in the semiotics of the face, because we were working in a European project lasting 5 years on the semiotics of the face, and we said the physiognomic, the pathognomic, artificial and natural signs, relationship with the body and the clothes, the plastic elements, the direction of the subject's gaze, the positioning of the camera are very important features of an image that must be taken into account to be sure that an anonymized one produces a synthetic image that can have a similar interpretation. And so we presented my colleagues with this series of images produced out of famous people, so that we were sure that they knew these people and they were unable to recognize them after the process of anonymizing them with camouflage and the other tools. We presented them with images of non-famous people, but of course, young people, people with a gender which was not that well-defined, etc., etc. We produced images also in which the background was important, no? Because there were monuments that were recognizable, etc. And also images where there wasn't a face but a mask, no? Because we wanted also to put our reflection to the borders, no, of the semiotics of the face. And the results were this one. Obviously, the farther one moves away, when I tell you the results is what we could conclude after reading the analysis made by my colleagues, no? So, obviously, the farther one moves away from producing a copy of the original, the greater is the risk of creating something that communicates something else. Specifically, when paying attention to eliminating all those idiosyncratic traits that, for example, can lead to recognizing a face, let's say a scar or a birthmark in a particular spot of the forehead, or a place, such as the logo of a company in front of its headquarters entrance, it is important to keep intact all the elements that allow for typification of the people and the context in which they are found, but also to define the genre to which the image belongs, fashion, glamour, protest, maintaining its enunciative traits, shot from above or below, with the subjects representing looking in one direction or another, etc. More specifically, regarding faces and human bodies, it is necessary to always reproduce their physiognomic nature, gender, ethnicity, age, hairstyle, color, and style of hair, physical build, and pathognomic nature, expression, gazes, gestures. Falco, here you can see the different tools that we tested. So Falco was almost always identified as the least faithful due to its inability to reproduce backgrounds, and more importantly, because it alters some fundamental typological aspects of the original image, such as the age or ethnicity of the main subject. It often recognizes and retains the most important pathognomic traits, especially facial expressions, but this seems to be its only virtue. DP2, on the other hand, by replacing the original faces with others while keeping everything else unchanged, is often praised for its results, though it occasionally produces a collage effect that appears somewhat strange and unsettling. Furthermore, it is particularly weak in terms of physiognomics. It doesn't always reproduce ethnicity well. Enunciation, it doesn't recognize the direction of gazes as relevant. And plasticity, it can't replicate the same chromatic and eidetic effects as the components of the original image. Camouflage, base, and light fall somewhere in between, as they vary many more elements compared to DP2, which can sometimes lead to effects that are far from those of the original content. However, by working with backgrounds, objects, and gestures, they probably function better in terms of the anonymization we were looking for, anonymizing faces, but also their context, permitting at the same time similar interpretation. Nonetheless, it should be noted that the polished and consistently varied color effects of the images produced by camouflage light often make them semantically incomparable to the original ones. So, to go to the conclusions, well, the question was being unique, belonging to a class, but which one? No? Because, of course, I'm sure that David Beckham, Cristiano Ronaldo, and Rafael Nadal consider themselves as unique, and they are right to consider themselves as unique because they are champions and are human beings, of course. So everybody is unique, but we all know that when we enter into a process of interpretation, we start belonging to a class. You are all unique, but I see you here and you are colleagues, so you belong to the class of colleagues. You are human beings, you belong to the class of human beings, etc., etc. Interpretation has always to do, as Saussure teaches us, with classification. But to which one? It depends, as my favorite semiotician of the past says in his book, Pertinence and Pratique, Luis Prieto, it depends on the practice, on what you want to do when interpreting things. Because if you know what you want to do, you perfectly know what is pertinent in what you are interpreting. Because you know the code, no? To make the interpretation, to make pertinence and practice. So we have to ask ourselves, what Lia can obtain out of her experiment on camouflage, and what can Lia obtain out of us as human beings when we will have to interpret the images produced by her tools. Well, can she produce images, AI-generated images for many interpretations? Or is it better to produce AI-generated images just for one interpretation? It depends, no? Well, of course, if you consider the images of the sport champions, Armani knew in advance which interpretation he wanted to achieve, no, out of his audience. And so he knew in advance perfectly which were the pertinent traits made pertinent by the code used by his audience to give the interpretation that he wanted out of the different images that he produced. So we can say that if Lia wanted to produce images that were suitable for a socio-semiotic research, and if her customers, the semiotician, knew in advance a theory of what they wanted to see in the synthetic images, well, the semiotician would have told Lia, these pertinent traits mustn't ever change. You can change whatever you want, and you produce synthetic images that can be useful for my research, because in my research I look for results that just tell me if I'm right or wrong with my theory, with my starting theory. But if you don't have a theory, can you reach a suitable result, no, by using these tools? Well, it depends. Here I tell you the word fresco, and I let Lia conclude this discussion, because Lia knows what fresco means, also because she technically created it.
Thank you. To conclude this and try to bring this discussion to a quick conclusion, because I think we are running out of time. This interaction between my discipline and the point of view of semiotics leads us to interrogate ourselves on which metrics we can use to actually measure the quality of the generated images. We are engineers, so we like to measure things quantitatively, but we also need to measure things quantitatively because neural networks are trained by mathematical functions. So if we do not have a mathematical function, we don't know how to tell the network that what needs to be optimized. Generally speaking, a lot of the community is using measures that are based on the distribution of the activation of the neural networks, or clip score or similar scores, which will give you a number that tells whether two images are similar or not. But this is a very crude number that is not cannot be necessarily traced back to specific quantities of specific aspects of the image that are retained or changed. Within facets, sorry, you need to go. We developed a platform which is called Fresco, which stands for computational observation, in which we try to make operational some of the concepts that come from visual semiotics, and in particular to extract, using computer vision tools, certain characteristics that are typical of the plastic figurative content of the image, such as, for example, the color palette, the face key points, the gaze direction, the context. And our goal is to use these quantities to also measure whether two images are similar enough. For example, we could say that when we compare the different methods, we could say, for example, that using visual DNA, Deep Privacy 2 is more similar to the original image than the other methods, which makes sense because most of the image is actually the same pixel-wise. But this doesn't really tell us a lot about what is actually maintained. Or we can measure, for example, if the images have more or less a similar palette to the original one. We can measure, for example, if the head pose and the gaze direction are more or less similar. And in this way, we can tell more about which aspects of the communication intent are preserved in the synthetic image. And of course, this is still, to a certain extent, a work in progress, because this information is not by design. Camouflage is not yet designed to preserve all of this information. And for example, we can see that the methods are very, very similar in terms of the way they preserve, or better, not preserve, the gaze direction, or that certain methods are more capable of preserving the ethnicity of the original image. And with this, I conclude, and I really thank you for your attention and also for your patience in our English presentation.
Thank you very much to both of you. We are really, really admirative, very, very admired to face to your work. I know that two colleagues want to ask a question, but I would like to begin to say that all the parameters you spoke about, ethnicity, gender, and so on, obviously their importance depend on the relevance, as Prieto says. So it's obvious that if we want to reproduce beauty, we have to maintain something, social parameters, we have to obviously to judge in different ways and so on. As far as beauty is concerned, I asked this question about beauty because in the frame of facets, I wrote a paper on beauty. So I was speaking about beauty and algorithms, and in this sense, beauty could be defined by key points and by certain relations between key points. I call beauty diagram. Do you think that if you decide, for instance, in a fashion image, to transfer the diagram, the person can be completely different, but the diagram, the relation between key points, remain stable? Do you think that in an aesthetic, fashionable fashion photo, this can be considered as relevant, or the singularity of the star has to be maintained because the star is something else, is something linked to a certain history of performances. I wanted also to say, it's no longer a question, but I wanted also to say that I was interested to the difference between training on syntactic data and testing on original data. It's possible that if you want to say something more, it's possible that our public as well, our audience, could be interested to understand better the difference between training and testing, the different data, and obviously it's not a question either. I wonder when you can say, when you separate the features of an image in the latent space, how do you understand the limits between I lose the information, I keep the information? For you, even probably for us, it would be difficult to understand when you can do the difference. And then
super good questions. Let me start to give you an answer as a semiotician, because I cannot answer from an engineering point of view. And I also have to tell you that since I collaborate with Lia since 6 or 7 years, I don't remember, every time I speak in a context like this, when I talk about the research that I do with Lia, I cannot ever answer by saying something without Lia consenting, no? Because it's very interesting because this research is very much related to the way of functioning of a tool, no, of an informatic tool, no. So, from a semiotic point of view, I think absolutely yes, Maria Giulia. If you have some key points whose relationship is determined, this is a structure that makes sense because you know what these key points mean, because they are part of the signifier that relate to a signified. And if we consider that structuralism still makes sense, you are inside of a structure in which there is a code that tells you that a signifier stands for a signified. You reproduce the main features of the signifier, you change everything else, and you produce an image that can be anonymized. I think it is possible, but Lia will tell you if yes or not, but I think absolutely yes. For what concerns the unicity of an image, for example, the unicity of the image of a movie star, etc. I think, but let me tell you, maybe it's ideological and I apologize, but I feel myself at home here because we are in the Séminaire of Gray Mass. I am a structuralist, so I cannot consider the unicity of an image as something meaningful unless the notion of unicity makes sense inside of a structure. No? If we oppose unicity to typification, unicity makes sense because it's in a structure, in a semantic structure, in opposition to typification. And so I will never, as a structuralist semiotician, work on the unicity of an image because, as I told you before, I believe that when you interpret an image, you always typify it, no? Because you always say, well, this movie star is beautiful. This movie star is stupid. So he belongs to the class of beautiful people. He belongs to the class of stupid people. How can you say that something doesn't make sense inside of classes? Because science, the science that we use to interpret things, are classes. If we follow the notion of Saussure, what a sign is, and the notions that we always used in structuralism. If we want to go outside of structuralism and follow other theories, it's absolutely possible. It makes sense. We can talk about it, but it's not our research because our research is a structuralist research. And now I leave the floor to Lia.
Thank you for the question about beauty. I think it's a very interesting question because it points directly to the type of discourse that we're trying to do. If your interest is in preserving the level of beauty of an image and say that the anonymized image must be comparable in terms of perceived beauty according to whatever the culture defines as beauty, you can use that information to guide the anonymization process. And it makes it much easier to anonymize because the more information you can lose, the easier it is to break the link between the perceived identity and the original identity. The question becomes then technical. Can you encode your notion of beauty, your measure of beauty into a mathematical descriptor that can be added to stable diffusion? And do we know how to use that information in order to guide stable diffusion? So it is a technical question. We can use, among the descriptors that we have, we are already using the key points and of the face and the body. So in principle, yes, we would probably even make it simpler by eliminating everything else and just keeping that particular information and give it a stronger weight. We would have to try, but I don't see theoretically a reason why not. However, we still must bear in mind, it's something that we didn't talk about, but it is there, that stable diffusion is trained on a corpus. And when you sample from the latent space of stable diffusion, you are in a way incorporating certain biases. The control will push the image towards your guidance because the guidance provided by spatial constraint is much stronger than the guidance provided by text alone. And to be honest, in the future, we would like to almost do it without a textual prompt, or which would simplify certain aspect. But we observed that stable diffusion tends to beautify images a lot, which is probably due to the fact that it is trained on selected images. So you don't typically share online the images when you wake up in the morning. You dress up nicely and you put your makeup on and then you take your image. So it is, in certain settings, the images appear to be much younger. Defects are normalized. And in general, it is possible that we're bringing the generated images closer to an average face, which looks generally more familiar and therefore usually looks a little bit more pleasant. So there is this element between the control that we are giving explicitly and the control that we are incorporating from Stable Diffusion and its effect. For example, I read I don't recall the reference, but there was a study maybe a couple of years ago that images generated by Stable Diffusion appear to be more authoritative, more familiar than images generated that real images, because they are kind of average images and therefore less strange, less off-putting in a way.
Okay, thanks a lot. Adrian, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thank you for the nice presentation.
Okay.
So it's a little bit in line with what you just said, but maybe you can elaborate further. So basically, you suggest to replace the faces of the people by faces generated by Stable Diffusion somehow. But Stable Diffusion has been trained on databases of people who did not give the consent.
Yeah.
So aren't you delaying the problem or creating potentially a new problem by using this process? Because you just claim, okay, this face it can be shown. Let's replace it by a face for which I don't know if it can be shown or not. So what is your take on this?
This is very, very interesting point of view. As a matter of fact, we presented this research at the Responsible AI workshop at CVPR last year, which was co-organized by a bunch of people from industry, including Meta and Google. And we had basically the same discussion, which one of my PhD students summarizes: can we use data that was not responsibly collected to generate images that are somewhat classified as responsible AI? And this is certainly an issue. But in general, I wouldn't say that images of the face are considered always not private. It depends on the country, you're right. Many of these, in fact, many are collecting data sets outside of the European Union to circumvent the GDPR. But it also depends on what you know about the image. So, for example, in our case, in the case of facets, it was not necessarily the fact that we had facial images that was a problem. It is the fact that we knew that those facial images were profile pictures. So since you have other information about the image, which is where the image was taken, you can use that information to trace back to the original identity, which makes the image non-anonymous. So it is true what you're saying. Images scraped in Lion, B, and other very large data sets, it is not clear whether whether they are collected in a responsible way. It is also very clear to me that individual consent is very hard to obtain. So we need a different mechanism to negotiate the individual and collective consent. Because at some point, we probably need a mechanism to consent as a society to certain practice, not just at the individual level. But they're not necessarily non-private data, because the not the images that are shared online, if properly detached from its provenance, and if the person is not famous, but if the person is famous, he or she has renounced to their privacy, so it's not a problem.
Federico, Emanuele, Gilles. Povera Rossana, no. Let's go. No,
Thank you very much for this wonderful example of hybridization between visual semiotics and visual science. But in truth, my question is really connected to the Adrienne one. I was wondering on the background of the question about the heterogeneity of LLM and the problems of LLM collapse. I was wondering if this process of camouflage and preserved meaning, importantly, you see it in terms of a key a way to improve, to enhance LLM heterogeneity by means of making usable data taken on the web.
Thank you. I'm not so sure that this research can be directly translated to LLM, but I see your point. There is certainly a problem related to acquiring training data. In fact, this brings me back to the fact that I didn't answer your second question. Sorry, I completely forgot about the difference between training and testing.
No problem. No.
I think there are two problems here. One is the fact that it is very hard to train a generative model based on data generated by generative models themselves, which will lead you to collapse. So typically what we do is actually use synthetic data to train discriminative models. So for example, if you want, there are a few examples that if you want to train an autonomous car to recognize pedestrian, it is actually better to train it in Grand Theft Auto than it is to acquire real data, because it's much easier to have a lot of variety. It's much easier to have corner cases which you don't have in real life. So a lot of the idea of using synthetic data to train real data, to train machine learning models is actually related to training classifiers or any other type of old-fashioned discriminative model, which is not as friendly as generative AI, but are still useful and need that kind of variety and that kind of privacy-preserving properties, etc. The concept of whether this can be used for training LLMs or a visual language model, I'm not so sure. I think for that we will have the opposite. We will have so much AI-generated data that we cannot find the real data anymore to train them. Or we do not have, the internet is not keeping up with the scale at which the training data sets are growing. So we need a way probably to either use data more efficiently and change the paradigm, not just scale, which is a good paradigm from an industrial point of view, but not necessarily from a scientific or ecological point of view, or we need something else. But I'm not necessarily sure this is a way that you can go.
Rossana, merci beaucoup. Rossana, lui si sacrifica e ti lascia al tuo posto. Ma sì, Et puis Gilles. Et, comme vous voulez, les deux.
For you, like always, was a process of producing image and reading image, because you separate control and proceeding and decoding. Because you're reasoning like an engineer. The user make also control on the decoding. He said, it's me, it could be me, it could be me. So you will adjust the decoding. For the user working some sequence. A question for you, said for grammars, the meaning came from a structural viewpoint, the typification, which is the result. An image is good, it is a typification, not full of image, you are including the image. So you got good typification, you need a structure. It's true in Russell term, but on internet and policy, you could have typification inside a process, a sequential process. We have the discussion with logo morphogenetic approach. So it's better to focus on this because only with this processuality of image.
Can you make an example? Because otherwise I don't understand what you mean when you say typification in the process.
User facing your dispositive of full image. It could be Photoshop, which you do with people. Some image you accept, some image you refuse. So you put the criteria. I want camouflage, but I want to achieve identity. I want to achieve typification, which is the result. The balance between camouflage and identity control is typification. It could be it's not what I mean.
So you mean
typification is in process too.
Yeah, I understand now.
I take a polar prime. Yesterday, no. The best way, when you get camouflage, you put a mustache.
Yeah.
Oh, yesterday there was a movie on Putin. All the team on Putin, we came from same area. You see different press. You can see the Arctic. No, the Arctic on TV. Sometimes you say face. You need to address. Why do they choose Putin for all this configuration of that criminal public official? Putin is a more balanced image. So you see the process politically. You cannot have all the structure.
Okay, I understand.
Thank you. For your question, I think it raises a very interesting viewpoint, which we hadn't time to investigate yet, because in camouflage, our perspective was a third-party perspective. We have images, we want to anonymize them, but the owner of the image is not involved in the anonymization process. It is very different if you take your image and you anonymize it and you want to use it as a proxy for your identity. And I think this is a very interesting point where we didn't have time to tackle it, nor I know of anyone that has really investigated the self-perception of anonymized images. We have some anecdotal evidence because we did an experiment during an event which we organized at Polytechnique di Turin, which is called Biennale Tecnologia. And we actually asked people to anonymize themselves on the fly and observe their reactions. And some were amused, some were almost disgusted by the result. So I think this is an aspect which should be taken into account, but we didn't. I think Silvia did some fieldwork, Silvia Barbotto did some fieldwork on this with within the context of the facets, but I don't know if what were the results or if she got to investigate this part of self-perception, what to use, when you use this sort of tool as a sort of mirror in which you are filtered in a way by a tool which is produced by society in a way. So I think this is very interesting, but I don't have any data to support any hypothesis yet.
Rosanna, tu?
No, I have to give him an answer about processuality in this process. Thinking about the process in creating camouflage. Well, first of all, you have to think about what was the purpose of the research, because the research was based on the idea that a tool like camouflage can create autonomously an image that can be interpreted the same way by people, but synchronically, no? I mean that if I and my 4 colleagues watch the images produced by Camouflage, Falco, etc., we don't have to recognize the identity of the people or the places inside of it, but we have to give them the same interpretation, more or less. So it is synchronic, not diachronic. And so, well, you have to train this tool to produce things that in a very specific moment, if put in front of an interpreter, take this interpreter to give more or less the same interpretation of the synthetic image and of the original one. Maybe processuality is something that we can also work on, because if I well understand your point, you can also work in asking the tool to present you with 2 or 3 images that are different, but processually create an anonymization that in the first image is super anonymized, in another image is alpha anonymized, etc. And you as an interpreter decide whether the first one is better, the second one is better. Maybe we can do that, but I think it would be energy consuming, time consuming, and I don't know if from an engineeristic point of view, it would be acceptable. And for what concerns the fact that, our interpretation of what anonymity means can also processually change in time, I think that it's absolutely true. And maybe we have to train the machine time by time by changing the code, no, for anonymization. I don't know if I've answered, but maybe we can have a confrontation. And Rosanna.
So thank you very much for your contribution. It will be very short, but we can speak out of the room. I would like to come back to your conclusion of the notion of relevance. I think that in semiotics, I think we need to come back to this notion, because in a digital material environment, this notion is the process. We have a physical relevance, we have a semiotic, a semantic relevance, we have a syntactic relevance. Is very difficult to say this in English, in French. But so we have, I think, different layers of relevance which converge or in a processual dynamic.
No.
So I think there is a very semiotic interest to come back to this notion and to analyze this watching to what these processes of decomposition of images or recomposition and different levels of.
Maybe it's also possible to do it because these tools are digital, no? So you can imagine a palette like in Photoshop in which you move the mouse from a point to another and you see how the images change, no? So maybe it is also possible to do that and to stop the image and to create exactly the frame in which you say, well, here it is anonymized by maintaining more or less the same meaning. I don't know. We have to ask Lia. As I told you before, all the times that I'm interviewed by people on this kind of research, I always say, well, semiotically it makes sense, but then we have to see if technologically it makes sense too, and which tools we can use to translate these ideas into engineering.
But you have to process, machine process and reading process. You need to not to control, but to consider the interaction process. In other words, semiotic, cultural question. So, to process in parallel.
I think the interesting thing about this duality of the reading process and the generating process is that in anonymization, the AI first reads the image and then generates a new one. So what we need to do is actually to model two processes, one that reads and one that generates. And the better we are at approximating in the reading process the information that we want to preserve, the better we can be at generating an image that is actually useful, whatever that means in the specific context.
Maybe another thing that would be interesting to you is that Fresco, which is a tool that we developed together, but we didn't have time to talk about it deeply, is a tool based on generative AI, but also on semiotics, in which you describe every image by using semiotic categories, like, I don't know, plastic semiotic categories, figurative semiotic categories, etc., etc. And AI gives a numerical description of this category. So it tells you that from a chromatic point of view, the image is described by that number. From a eidetic point of view, the image is described by that number. And then you have these numbers that describe the image. And then you can start varying the number of the shape, the number of the color, and seeing what happens in the anonymization process, but you can control it from a semiotic point of view, because you know the semiotic categories that are relevant all the time a human being encounters an image and has to interpret it. Because if we believe in semiotics, we have to believe that semiotics knows what happens when you have to interpret an image, which are the categories that you have to control, because most of the times an image can make sense from the point of view of these categories.
If you like the image, you put 1. If you don't like the image, you put 0, and there is a return to the machine.
Yes, you put 1 and 0, but to describe the color, to describe
this is actually, I think, is actually a really interesting point, because in principle, you could also incorporate human preference in the process as they do with LLMs. So LLMs, they're not just generative process of the text, they are aligned to human preferences by using reinforcement learning. So they rely on having someone that says, this answer is better than the other one. In principle, there are also techniques that do the same for images. this image is better than the other one, and you incorporated these in a preference model that you feed back to the AI in order to align the quality of the generated images with the expectations of the human person. The problem that I see with this approach is that your preference model becomes opaque, a black box, because it is based on whatever the aspects of the image are fed into the relevant.
Yes, it's not controlled.
It's not controlled.
Last question.
Do I have time?
Yes, we have time if someone helps me to arrange their. Now I'm coming as well.
Well, very quickly. My question concerns the relationship between fidelity and utility. So basically, utility means that you get from synthetic data the same psychometric or sociometric search result that you would get if you would to use the real data. So my question is, are there studies measuring difference with the same data set between real data and anonymized data on research questions? Because I think if you measure this, you would get also interesting quantities that you could also use for the level of anonymization you need.
I think I can answer for both to say that you are absolutely right. So that eventually this is where we would like to go. I think the question for us is whether we are ready to do that, because the way that we test utility in machine learning is not that expensive. You train a model and you see if the performance is the same. If you need to, you do a user study, or that becomes much more expensive. So it is something that we can do every so often. So we need to be technologically ready to do that. So I think that this is
it was amazing and very, very interesting for us as semioticians to do that part of the research, but also time consuming and very difficult to find the way to do that research. And so we can imagine how much it would cost to do it more broadly. But it's very, very. But very interesting.
I think we have some ideas in that direction. I have some ideas in that direction that I think we can pursue in a reasonable time.
Exploiting the students.
And to me, that is also very much linked to our concept of making semiotics a little bit more quantitative, because that could also be somehow a proxy of this approach. So if we can if we can validate a more quantitative approach to analyzing a corpus, which is still aligned with semiotics principle, but can be it can be made automatic. This means makes it much easier to answer this sort of question and to have a proxy of what would be the outcome, so that we can use it to provide feedback for us. Because we, as technicians, we need a regular feedback in order to improve our models. And a user study is generally very difficult to implement while the process is while the technique is being developed.
Je pense que ça a été une séance formidable. Merci à vous qui nous avez suivis de chez vous. Merci à vous ici en présence. On se reverra dans 3 semaines, le 5 mars, avec des interventions de Jean-François Baudron et de Didier Salat.